Good morning, everyone. As Dave said, I am Ben Kinsey. I'm a final year, I won't say how many, definitely more than three, student in the MDiv program here at AST in the United Church of Canada stream. And yeah, I just want to begin today by thanking all of you for attending our Festival of Learning today and throughout the week. It is truly a pleasure and honor to be sharing our hard work with this community. I also want to thank Dr. Dave Sinos for being the MDiv graduate project class's fearless and steadfast guide and leader throughout this process, Samuel for running the tech, and all of my classmates in the graduate project class for their support and fellowship throughout this journey. I also want to thank Dr. Alida Faber for her work as my academic advisor throughout my entire time here at AST, whose diligence and patience with me has gotten me to this point, as well as her work with the Research Ethics Board and the entire REB for saying yes to my project and to all the projects that we've seen here this week. I'd also like to thank Dr. Mikiko Terashima for bringing me on board at the Peach Research Unit at Dalhousie University, whose work has been an enormous inspiration for this project. And last and certainly not least, I'd like to thank my fiancée, Catherine, for all the support she gives me every day and for keeping me throughout this journey of mine. And so now, without further ado, I'd love to present to you my project, All Are Welcome, Experiences of Physical Accessibility in United Church of Canada Buildings. Let us make humankind in our image, as according to our likeness. These words from Genesis 1:26, this idea that we are made in the very likeness of the divine, imago Dei, lies at the very heart of the Christian faith. Many theologians throughout history have attempted to grapple with this concept, to reckon with the holiness of being created in the image of God. It is a humbling idea and a source of hope and affirmation of the sacredness of the body. Yet what does that sacredness of body mean to those who live with disabilities when so many churches embrace things like miracle healings as part of their worship tradition? What does it mean to be created in the image of God when images of God all too often fail to reflect the experiences and realities of disability? As Psalm 139:14 tells us, we are fearfully, wonderfully made by God. Yet what does it mean to be fearfully and wonderfully made when born with blindness, deafness, or the inability to walk? When so many ableist theologies and scriptural interpretations have linked disability to sin and to brokenness? And further still, what does all of this mean for those who develop or experience disability later on in life, either through age or through accident or injury? All of these questions have enormous theological and liturgical implications. They are also enormous questions in their own right. And to be very clear, I do not successfully solve or answer them in this project, nor do I attempt to. What I have tried to do is at least begin to unpack them. And so to attempt to do that unpacking, I've done what any good researcher, theologian, and AST hopefully soon to be graduate would do. Ask another question. And it is this very question which forms the basis of this project. What is the experience of accessibility at church buildings within the United Church of Canada among people living with mobility disabilities? Say that 10 times fast. For the sake of clarity, for the purposes of this project, whenever I refer to a mobility disability, I am referring to a condition that impairs somebody's movement. These disabilities can be permanent or temporary, they can be visible or invisible, and they can require aids like walkers or canes or wheelchairs, or not at all. Terms like physical accessibility, features, and barriers also come up frequently in this project. And so when I refer to those, I am referring to physical elements of a building or space that improve accessibility, like ramps or automatic door buttons, or elements that hinder accessibility, like stairs and heavy doorways. Why this question? Why specifically ask about the experiences of accessibility at United Church of Canada buildings? Well, for starters, I have been a member of the United Church of Canada for my entire life. And as a student in the United Church of Canada stream in the Master of Divinity program here at AST, I am deeply invested in the life of the United Church and its members and adherents. Many of us in the United Church of Canada have long prided ourselves on the inclusivity of the denomination and of our open and welcoming approach to all people. It is incredibly important to me personally that we live up to that ideal and constantly assess and challenge ourselves to improve upon it. I have also personally become much more acquainted with and passionate about the issue of accessibility over the last 18 months or so. In September of 2025, I began working at the Planning for Equity, Accessibility, and Community Health, or PEACH, research unit at Dalhousie University. As the name suggests, PEACH's research is heavily focused on issues of accessibility, equity, and disability. And we strive to study and find ways to build truly accessible communities for all, regardless of ability and disability. And this research and this work has greatly influenced and inspired my project here today. Beyond my personal interest and connection to this research, there is also a practical element to this question as well. Churches play an essential role in our communities, yes, as places of worship, but also as central community hubs for countless organizations, clubs, and events. And given this role, it is essential they be as accessible to the public as possible. Around 30% of Canadians have at least one disability. And that number here in Nova Scotia increases to 40%. Accessibility then is not just a nice thing to have in church buildings, it is a necessity. By asking this research question, I hope to provide a starting point for wider discussions and efforts towards accessibility within the United Church. With regards to methodology, I knew that in order to answer my question, I would need to hear directly from people with lived experience of mobility disability, and that I would be basing my research on the stories and experiences they shared with me. As such, I adopted a phenomenological approach to this study, with the aim of identifying key themes regarding the specific phenomenon of experiences of accessibility among people with mobility disabilities. So I conducted a series of one-on-one interviews with 5 participants from 2 churches. And these interviews were all conducted remotely over Zoom. And every participant, to be clear, had some form of mobility disability. And as I conducted these interviews and listened to these stories and experiences, a number of key themes began to emerge. What should be noted is that in establishing these themes, it became apparent that while the participants did discuss their experience of accessibility at their respective churches directly and at length, they also spoke at length about the factors that shaped and contributed to those experiences and to the result of those experiences. And as such, I have categorized the major themes along those lines. I also want to mention that what I think is so profound and interesting about these themes and about the answers my participants gave me is that all of them go far beyond a sort of surface level inventory of physical accessibility features and barriers at their respective churches. Don't get me wrong, my sample size may be on the smaller side, but if these interviews are any indication, we in the United Church have some work to do when it comes to church basements, choir lofts, pulpits, and yes, pews. But as I hope to convey over the next little while, these interviews revealed that accessibility is about so much more than a checklist of features like ramps and elevators. It is about what message having these features sends to people with disabilities, and about what having an accessible church building means for true inclusion of everyone in the worship and community life of the church. In terms of these thematic categories of experience, factors, and result, let's start with experience. So the first of the major themes around experience I identified is also one of the most important and challenging that emerged from these interviews. That is the theme of the individuality and uniqueness of each participant's experience of disability and accessibility at their church. As I mentioned earlier, all the participants in this project experience some kind of degree of mobility disability. It can often be all too easy for able-bodied people to assume people with similar disabilities share a sort of homogeneous experience. That could not be further from the truth. Without exception, every single participant's experiences were entirely unique to the individual, including amongst people who attend the same church. What one participant viewed as a physical feature enhancing accessibility, another viewed as a barrier. Where one participant would note positive attitudes towards accessibility amongst the congregation, another would note persistent problematic practices and behaviors. I'll give you some examples. In one instance, two participants who attended the same church each individually named the same church event in their respective interviews. One participant held this event up as an example of a totally barrier-free event, noting they had no problems at all in participating. The other participant held it up as an example of barriers to their participation in the community life of the church. In another case, one participant noted that they felt their church building was virtually barrier-free, with very few exceptions. Another participant from the same church, meanwhile, made note of the many, many barriers to access they encountered, and the challenges that presented to them in fully participating in church life. Time and again, I encountered this phenomenon in every interview with every participant. Take a look at the quotes I have on the screens here. Well, the church I attend is completely accessible. So I sing in the choir, and I don't find the choir area really accessible. The only barrier I can think of is that there's no way that I could get up to the pulpit. All three of these quotes come from participants who attend the same church. All of them have overall quite positive things to say about accessibility at their church, but all of them also have completely different experiences of that accessibility. It became abundantly clear throughout this project that it is absolutely critical to keep in mind the uniqueness of each individual experience, both in the context of this research project and in wider accessibility efforts on a church and denominational level. So continuing with the category of experience, the second major theme that I want to touch on is the complexity of the participants' experiences of accessibility in their respective churches. Given the uniqueness of each participant's experience and needs, it is perhaps unsurprising that these experiences also are complicated. Accessibility, after all, is a complicated issue. As we discussed, what works for one person may not for another. There is no one-size-fits-all solution, for lack of a better word, to building accessible environments, and churches are no exception to this. The participants' individual experiences were also further complicated on an emotional level. Throughout the interviews, it became abundantly clear that every single participant cared deeply about their churches and about the issue of accessibility at their churches. They want their churches to succeed. They want their churches to be as accessible as possible. And it is this care that makes their experiences of accessibility so complicated. On the one hand, for the most part, the participants had positive things to say about their churches and went out of their way time and again to reiterate that their fellow congregants were good people who were trying their best. And yet at the same time, a number of participants raised serious and real concerns and frustrations about accessibility at their churches or the lack thereof. One participant, for example, noted safety concerns they have when navigating their parking lot in the wintertime, but also went out of their way to reiterate that they didn't want to imply their church wasn't doing their best at winter maintenance. Another participant at a separate church noted the complicated feelings they have when accessibility features are put in badly or incorrectly. On one occasion, they were glad and thankful that an accessibility ramp had been put in at one of the front entrances. But those feelings of gratitude and thankfulness quickly transformed into frustration and disappointment when they used the ramp to get up to the front door, only to realize there was no automatic button, and they still couldn't get in. This participant nevertheless expressed several times throughout the interview that the congregants at their church were good people who were trying their best. This constant balancing of deep love and often protectiveness for their churches and the congregants themselves, balanced with the real and deep frustration and hurt of encountering barriers to accessibility at their churches, very much highlighted the complexity of the participants' experience of accessibility. When paired with the challenges of addressing individual physical accessibility needs, this complexity becomes even more apparent. It became very clear throughout this project that, again, complexity of these experiences is critical to keep in mind both again in my project and in wider efforts. Now that we've talked about the sort of experiences directly, I want to bring up some of the factors that the participants really focused on. And the first of these factors is the importance of attitudes and culture at the congregations themselves towards accessibility efforts. Though their experiences with accessibility were again all unique, every single participant highlighted the importance of the culture of welcome and acceptance at their church as a key element of that experience. One participant, who uses a manual push wheelchair during church services, made note of how members of the congregation at their church frequently offer assistance to help navigate them around the church. Quote, "When I have this push wheelchair, and people in the congregation quite often help me. I get to the door of the sanctuary, I pick up the order of service, and someone will say, 'Can I push you down to the front?' And they'll sit in the first 2 rows with me. And after the service, when I come out of the sanctuary, I'll often find a strong woman or man and ask, 'Would you mind me pushing me to the bathroom?' And they are very, very open to doing that." Other participants made note of the care taken by their fellow congregants to ensure their participation in church activities and events. One participant, for example, noted that at Christmas time, their church put together a Celtic labyrinth for prayer and meditation, but that it had been built specifically to account for the space needed for people using walkers and wheelchairs. While most spoke positively of their experiences with congregational attitudes, there are some negative experiences as well. One participant had more complicated feelings about their church community's overall attitudes and commitment to accessibility and inclusion. They noted they felt their church was getting better, but that they also made note of certain exclusionary frustrations that continue, in particular how hurtful it is to show up to an event only to be told you need to go around the back because the front isn't accessible. Quote, "What that says to me, and again, it might not be fair, but what it signals to me is that you don't care about me." What is clear from these interviews is that the congregational attitudes towards accessibility and inclusion of people with disabilities are critical to the experience of accessibility in church buildings. And positive and negative experiences with those attitudes are arguably as important as the presence of physical barriers and features. Another key factor that emerged throughout these interviews was the role the clergy play in shaping the experience of accessibility at the churches they should serve. Again, every single participant directly mentioned this role. One noted, for example, how lucky their church was because their minister knew, quote, "how to get every extra dollar around." Another participant mentioned how kind and welcoming their minister was and was appreciative of their thoughtfulness in using assistive devices throughout worship services. Another participant at the same church noted that their minister was incredibly inclusive and warm at their Blue Christmas service and offered to pray for them, something that they had never experienced before. Another participant at a different church linked the culture of inclusion and accessibility at the church directly to the influence of the minister. Quote, "Well, the message at this church is inclusive, very inclusive, and it trickles down from the minister right through to the congregation. And again, I have to give them top points for that." While many of the participants' experiences with the clergy were positive, this was not, unfortunately, always the case. One participant noted that they had a very painful experience with the previous minister. And I should note here that this experience did not directly involve or was not related directly to physical accessibility of the church. However, it nevertheless seriously damaged the relationship with their church and their sense of being able to access their church. The stories and experiences shared with me in these interviews made it abundantly clear. The clergy play an absolutely vital role in the experience of accessibility at the churches they serve, not only in individual interactions, but also in establishing and fostering cultures of accessibility and inclusion within their church communities. I'd also like to give an honorable mention to the role of technology. This is less a theme directly to my research question because the technology that came up has nothing to do with the physical accessibility of these church buildings. But again, every single participant mentioned the role assistive devices and technologies play in the experience of accessibility at their church. And so I want to give a mention to it. For the most part, again, they were positive about these technologies, though, surprise, surprise, every experience was unique to the individual. One participant, for example, was very thankful for the projector screens at their church as a big aid for them as they struggled with vision issues. Another person, however, who also struggles with vision issues, mentioned how challenging the screens were, especially if a slide had a bad color as the background or poor contrast with the text. Another participant still mentioned the screens again, nothing to do with vision, but it was a lot easier for them to not have to hold on to a hymn book while standing up. Several participants also made note of hearing aids and auditory booster packs, which for one participant was essential to their ability to participate in the life of the church. I should also note the role that Zoom and other remote technologies played in how they relate to this project. As I mentioned earlier, every single interview is done remotely. That was not my intent initially, it's just how it played out. For some participants, this technology was incredibly beneficial and was the only reason they were able to participate in this project. At the same time, however, a number of people who expressed interest in this project found it to be a huge barrier, and it stopped them from participating, either due to the technology itself or to privacy concerns about Zoom, and or just generally remote versus in-person interviews. So though this is more an incidental finding than one directly related to my research question, it still is clear that technology has a major role to play in the experience of accessibility at churches. But again, it is not a one-size-fits-all solution. Just as the participants' experiences with accessibility at their churches were all deeply personal and unique, so too are experiences with assistive and remote technologies. Now that we've addressed the experiences and the factors that shaped them, I'd like to talk a little bit about the result of those experiences. The result was that how the participants' experience with accessibility at their church affected their sense of belonging in their church community. For those with positive experiences, it very much reaffirmed their sense of belonging. One participant, when asked about this, simply said, very short, easy answer, "I feel very much a part of this community." Another participant noted their struggles with aging and how important their positive sense of belonging at their church was to them in dealing with that. Quote, "I'm having trouble accepting those limitations and being happy with them. And I just keep thinking, well, I'm still here. God must still have a purpose for me. And I've been in a lot of churches, and I have never made the kind of friends and had the social life that I have at this one before." Another participant, when asked if their experience with accessibility affected their sense of belonging at their church, answered with a resounding yes, stating, "For me, inclusion is a huge thing." She noted that as an LGBTQ+ woman with a disability, inclusion and her sense of inclusion at her church were extremely important. And that when she feels included, she's willing to play a much more active role in the community. Quote, "If I feel included, I'm willing to go all in." Though the participants generally were positive about their experiences with accessibility and how it affected their sense of belonging, several did make note of instances where this was not the case. And these negative experiences were frustrating and hurtful for the participants and made them feel excluded and alienated from their community. What is clear from these interviews is that both in positive and negative cases, these experiences were very emotional and important to the participants, and that the experience of accessibility has an enormous impact on the sense of belonging in church communities. So what do we take away from these stories and experiences and the themes that emerged from them? First, no two experiences of disability are the same. As we seek to build truly inclusive communities of faith, we must challenge our assumptions that disability is a homogeneous experience, and instead recognize the incredible uniqueness of everyone who comes to the church doors, regardless of ability and disability. And to that point, our second major takeaway: accessibility is complicated. What is accessible for one person can be a barrier for another. Too often, churches view accessibility as a checklist that you put in a ramp, hand railings, or an elevator. And to be clear, you should put in the ramp, the hand railings, and the elevator, but do it right. and know that it is not a be-all and end-all solution. What may be helpful to one person may be irrelevant or even detrimental to another. Finding a balance that makes churches as accessible as possible is what we should be striving for. And thirdly, it is essential that churches recognize the enormous effect the attitudes of clergy and congregations themselves have on experiences of accessibility. Physical accessibility features are extremely important, but equally so is the welcome and acceptance congregations offer to those with disabilities. And given the numbers of us here who are in ministry or seeking to enter ministry, ordained, lay, or otherwise, it is very important. I really feel it's important to express how critical and profoundly clergy have an impact on those senses of accessibility. Ministers are not the only leaders in the United Church of Canada, but they truly can make or break an experience for someone with a disability. With those takeaways in mind, there are some implications that are worth considering. There are several limitations to this research project, including the small sample size of participants and participating churches. Further research with a greater number of participants from a wider number of church communities would be very beneficial, either in verifying or challenging the results of this project. An expansion of the scope of the research to include disabilities beyond mobility disability would also be extremely beneficial in getting a truer understanding of the experience of accessibility in United Church of Canada buildings, and would, on a practical level, enable the denomination and churches at large to sort of figure out where to put their focus in accessibility efforts. They also carry considerations for worship practices. Who is participating? How? In what way? Should all be considerations for any church seeking to improve accessibility. Congregational use of technology should also be considered. Are assistive devices being provided and utilized? Who are they helping? Are they helping? These are all questions that should very much be on everyone's minds, particularly given the shift to hybrid worship that many churches to this day continue since the COVID-19 pandemic. With all of this in mind, let's now go back to the beginning, to the research question at the heart of this project. What is the experience of accessibility at church buildings within the United Church of Canada among people living with mobility disabilities? Well, it's complicated. It depends who you ask. That may seem like a challenging answer, and well, it is. But I also think it's maybe the most important answer in this entire project. Because in my view, at the end of the day, if there is one thing I hope you take from this project, it's that accessibility is not a checklist. It is an aspiration, an ideal, a journey. It is about attitude and infrastructure alike. The United Church of Canada has dedicated itself to a number of major inclusion efforts over the past century, particularly the last several decades. And many of us within the United Church pride ourselves on that commitment to inclusion. Whether it be denominational efforts towards affirming our LGBTQ+ siblings in Christ, seeking reconciliation and right relation with the Indigenous peoples of this country, or more recently, the denomination's commitment to becoming an officially anti-racist denomination. The United Church of Canada has made an effort, most of the time, a lot of the time anyway, not always, but a lot of the time, to not shy away from the hard work of inclusion and justice. And accessibility should be no different. And to that point, there is a popular saying amongst disability activists and advocates: nothing about us without us. And we in the United Church of Canada should honor and respect that. The work of accessibility can and must be done in concert with people with lived experience of disability. And there's something that was made clear to me by the participants in this project, and it's that the desire to do that work and to help is there. To be clear, this does not mean we push all of the work of accessibility on to people with disabilities and just set them off to do it on their own. Like many marginalized communities, many people with disabilities often face burnout and fatigue from being called upon to teach, to educate, to participate in research projects like this one. It is imperative that the work, expertise, and time of people with lived experience of disability be respected and not taken for granted. But when that help and expertise is offered, let us accept it. Let us not be overwhelmed by the difficult work of combating ableism and building truly inclusive worship environments. Let us instead see it as a challenge to do and be better as people of faith, as an opportunity to do the work of Christ, an opportunity to truly build inclusive buildings and communities, an opportunity to listen to people with disabilities' stories and experiences, and ensure all are truly welcome in the life, leadership, and worship of our communities of faith. An opportunity to challenge ableist assumptions and theologies that denigrate and otherize people with disabilities, and instead seek ways of worship that celebrate the sacredness of every body. The United Church of Canada recently developed a new vision statement, the 3 pillars of which are deep spirituality, bold discipleship, and daring justice. And so let us live up to that vision. Let us live out that vision. Let us dig deep. Let us be bold. Let us be daring. And let us build a church in which all truly are welcome, where all know they reflect God's perfect likeness, fearfully and wonderfully made. Thank you and amen.